Thank you for joining ASMR Storytime. So tonight, again, I'm not going to do the unboxing. We have only 3 chapters left in this novel, so I'm going to push through and get us finished. I have plans for tomorrow doing a video with no talking. It's just going to be a video with a lot of different triggers. And then we will start a new book early next week. So let's go ahead and get started so we can get this one finished. Chapter 3. Benia had delivered the box as he had said he would, but I was not there to receive it. When he brought it to the garden gate, he was brusquely told that Dinar was sitting in the great hall with her son and could not be called away by a tradesman. The box was placed in a corner of the kitchen, and I did not see it until after Remus had left Thebes and the house had returned to normal. When the cook gave it to me, her curiosity overwhelmed her. How had something so elegant and rare come to be mine? And who was the man who had asked after me so eagerly? I said nothing of him or the box to anyone in the house, and the gossip soon died away. I sent no word to Benia either, hoping he would take my silence as a rejection of the indirect offer he had made me in the marketplace. Although I had been moved by his words and by his touch, I could not see myself living like other women. Despite Wereno's words, I was sure that Remus would tell the next and final chapters of my story. Merritt was furious at me for not turning Benia down. A man like that, so accomplished, so kind. She threatened never to speak to me again, but we both knew that could never happen. I was her daughter, and she would never cut me off. But Benia's box remained an embarrassment and a reproach to me. It did not belong in a garden shed. It was not made for a foreign-born midwife without status or standing. It was mine only because the carpenter had recognized my loneliness and because I had seen the need in him too. I filled the box with gifts from my mother's, but covered its gleaming beauty with an old papyrus mat so that it would not remind me of Benia, whom I resigned to the corner of my heart with other dreams that had died. The weeks flowed quietly into months, the passage of time marked by the stories of births, most of them healthy. I learned that a tonic made of the red madder growing in my garden eased childbirth for many, and Merritt and I were called to ever more distant neighborhoods. Once a bark was sent to bring us to the town of On, where a priest's favorite concubine lay dying. We found a girl far too young to be a mother, screaming in terror, alone in a room without the comfort of another woman. Shortly after we arrived, we closed her eyes, and I tried to free the baby, but she too was dead. Merritt went to speak to the father, who, far from bereaved, began to curse my friend and me for killing his wife and child. He rushed into the birthing chamber before I had time to cover the poor mother. The foreigner raised a knife to her, he shrieked. Only a surgeon can do such a thing. This woman is a menace. a demon sent from the east to destroy the kingdom of the river. He lunged at me, but Merritt stopped him, and with strength I did not know she possessed, pinned him against a wall, and tried to explain that I had cut the mother in hope of saving the child. But I saw no reason to explain myself. I looked into his eyes and saw an odious and petty soul, and I was filled with rage and pity for the young woman who lay at my feet. "Pervert," I roared, in the language of my mothers. "Foul son of a maggot, may you and the others like you wither like wheat in the desert. This was an unloved girl who lies here dead. The stench of her unhappiness clings to her. For this, you will die in agony." Both Merritt and the priest stared at me as I spewed out my curses, and when I was finished, the man began to shudder, and in a terrified whisper said, "A foreign sorceress in the house of the gods." The sound of our voices had drawn other priests who did not meet my eyes and held their brothers so we could leave. On the journey back, I watched the shoreline pass and remembered Ina's prophecy that I would find my heart's desire by the banks of a river. I shook my head over the irony of her vision and returned to my garden shed unsaddled and discontented. For the first time since my childhood, I was restless. I no longer dreamed of Shalem or his death, but woke up every morning haunted by visions of deserted landscapes, gaunt sheep, wailing women. I rose from my pallet painting, trying to name my disquiet. Merritt noticed gray hairs on my head and offered to make me a dye of ash and the blood of a black ox. I laughed at the idea, although I knew she used the potion and looked far younger than her years because of it. Her suggestion made me view my restlessness as nothing more than a sign of the passing years. I was nearly of the age when women stop bleeding at the new moon, and I pictured myself passing the twilight of my days in the familiar peace of Noctra's garden. I set a statue of Isis over my bed and prayed for the wisdom and tranquility of the Lady Goddess, healer of women and men. But I neglected to pray for the well-being of my earthly protectors. Late one night, I was awakened by the sound of howling cats, and the next morning, Noctra came to tell me that Renefer had died in her sleep. Her body was collected by priests who would prepare her body for the next life with elaborate ritual in her father's tomb in Memphis, where a statue had been prepared in her memory. The rites would last for 3 days. Noctra asked if I would like to attend the ritual with him. I thanked him but said no. He must have been relieved, for we both knew that there was no comfortable place for me among the celebrants. In the days after Renefer's death, I cursed her as much as I wept for her. She had been my savior and my jailer. She had given me Shalem and then stolen his memory. Finally, I did not know the woman at all. I had seen little of her since Remos had gone to school and had no idea how she kept busy all those years. If she spun or wove, if she slept the days away, if she wept at night for her son and her husband, if she hated me or pitied me or loved me. I dreamed in vivid detail in the nights following her death, and Renefer visited me in the form of a small bird flying out of the sunrise, screaming Shechem in a familiar voice that I could not name. The Renefer bird tried to lift people and objects from the ground, but had no strength, and beat her wings in frustration until she was exhausted and furious. Every night she disappeared into the sun shrieking. It seemed her troubled soul would never find peace. After 7 nights of that vision, I felt nothing but pity for her. Noctra died the following season, and for him I mourned without reservation. Honest, generous, good-humored, and always kind, he was the model of an Egyptian nobleman. My son was blessed to have had such a father, and I knew Remus would weep for the only Ba he had ever known. I assumed that Remus went to Memphis for the rites, though I was not told. Only Noctra had thought to tell me about my son's travels. With his death, I felt my connection to Remus weaken. After Nectra was gone, his wife went to live with her brother somewhere north in the Delta. The house would be given to a new scribe. Had Remus been a little older and more practiced in the politics of the temple, he might have been given the position. Instead, one of Nectra's rivals was chosen. Most of the staff would remain and the cook urged me to stay on too. But the chill in the eyes of the new mistress, who came to survey what was to be her home, made me want nothing less. Merritt, too, was facing a change. Her older son, Mina, had offered her a place under his roof in the Valley of the Kings. He had been appointed chief baker and given a larger house where his mother was welcome. Mina made the journey to see his mother and said that though many babies were born to the wives of the craftsmen in the valley, there were no skilled midwives and many women had died. Merritt would have been an honored citizen if she came to live among them. My friend was tempted. Since the disastrous journey to On, rumors had begun to circulate about the foreign-born midwife and her companion. The priest I had cursed had lost the use of his voice after I saw him, and then he went lame. There were fewer calls to attend at the births of the noble women, though their servants and the tradesmen's wives still sought us out. I knew that my friend relished the thought of honor and a new start, but she worried about living with a daughter-in-law and fretted about giving up the comforts of life in Thebes. She told her son that she would weigh his invitation until the following season, when the new year began. After all, she explained to me, the appearance of the dog star marked the most auspicious time for making changes. My friend and I weighed our choices, but we often fell silent, keeping our worst fears to ourselves. In truth, I had nowhere to go. Harriet had not offered me a place with her. I would simply have to stay where I was and hope for the best. If Merritt left for her son's house, loneliness would swallow me, but I kept still about that and listened as she described life in the valley. Merritt never considered leaving without me, but she worried about asking her daughter-in-law to put up with 2 women in her house. My friend presented her dilemma to her good mistress, and Rudedit begged her to stay and gave her word that I, too, would always have a place under her roof. But the lady's husband was nothing like Noctra. He was a narrow-minded tyrant with a temper that sometimes broke upon the backs of his servants, and even Rudedit kept her distance from him. My life would be pinched and furtive if I went to that house. I might have lost heart except for the consolation I found in my dreams, where a garden of 1,000 lotuses bloomed. Children laughed, and the strong arms held me safe. Merritt put great store in these dreams, and visited a local oracle who foresaw love and riches for me in the steaming entrails of a goat. The new year came, and Minna returned to see his mother. His wife, Shifri, accompanied him this time and said, "Mother, come home with us. My sons work with their father in the bakery all day, and I am often alone in the house. There is plenty of room for you to sit in the sun and rest, or if you wish to continue as a midwife, I will carry your kit and become your assistant. You will be honored in my husband's house, and after your death we will honor your memory with a fine stele with your name on the west side." Merritt was moved by her daughter-in-law's speech. Shifre was a few years younger than I, a plain woman except for her eyes, which were large and ringed with thick black lashes and radiated compassion. "Minna is lucky in you," said Merritt, taking the woman's hands in hers. "But I cannot leave Denair. Here, she is my daughter now, and without me she is alone in the world. In truth, she is the master midwife, and I am her assistant. It is she the women of royal Thebes call for, and when their time is at hand. I cannot ask you to take her in, and yet if you offer her the same hospitality, I believe you will be well rewarded in this life. She carries the mark of money and luck. She dreams with great power and sees through lies. All of this has rubbed off on me, and it will benefit you and your house too." Shifre went to her husband with Merritt's words. Minna was not pleased at the prospect of yet another aging woman in his house, but the promise of luck struck a chord with him. He came with his mother and wife to my shed to make me welcome, and I accepted his offer with genuine gratitude. I took a turquoise carob from my box and gave it to Minna. "Hospitality is the gods' own treasure," I said, placing my forehead to the ground before the baker, who was embarrassed to be shown such obeisance. "Perhaps my brother can give you his garden for your own," he said, helping me to my feet. "His wife has no knack with growing things, and my mother tells me you have a Cicerus own touch with the soil." Then it was my turn to be embarrassed at his kindness. How had I come to find so many kind people in life? What was the purpose of such good fortune? Minna's work called him home, so we had only a few days to prepare for our journey. First, I went to the marketplace and hired a scribe who wrote on behalf of unlettered people, and through him sent word to Remos, assistant to Car, the scribe residing in Kush, to inform him that his mother Dinar had moved to the Valley of the Kings, to the house of the chief baker called Mina. I sent him blessings in the name of Isis and her son Horus, and I paid the scribe double his fee to make sure the message would find my son. I gathered the herbs of my garden, taking cuttings of the roots as well as dried plants. As I worked, I remembered how my mothers stripped their gardens before leaving one life for another. I ventured into the market by myself and traded most of my trinkets for olive oil and castor oil, for juniper oil and berries, for I heard that few trees thrived in the valley. I scoured the stalls for the finest knife I could find, and the day before we left, Merritt and I went to the river and collected reeds enough to deliver 1,000 babies. I packed what I owned inside Benia's box, which had grown even more beautiful as the wood mellowed with age. Closing the lid, I tasted relief in my escape from an unhappy future. The night before I left the house of Nactre, I kept watch in the garden, walking around the pool, running my fingers over every bush and tree, filling my nose with the rich smells of blooming lotus and fresh clover. When the moon began to set, I crept inside the house and wandered past the sleeping bodies up to the roof. The cats rubbed against me and I smiled, remembering my first fright at seeing the first snakes on the land. All of my days in Egypt had been spent in that house, and looking back on them in the night air, I recalled little but good. The scent of my infant son in the face of Nacre, cucumbers and honeyed fish, Merritt's laughter and the smiles of the new mothers to whom I delivered healthy sons and daughters. The painful things wherein Rose's story, Renefer's choice, even my own loneliness, seemed like the knots on a beautiful necklace, necessary for keeping the beads in place. My eyes filled as I bade farewell to those days, but I felt no regret. I was sitting outside the garden door, my box and a small bundle beside me, when the others arrived in the morning. Rudidit walked with us as far as the ferry and embraced me before I got on the boat. She wept into Merritt's arms for a long while, but she was the only one weeping as the ferry pulled away from the shore. I waved at her once, but then I set my eyes to the west. The journey from the house of the scribe to the house of the baker took only 1 day, but the passage measured the difference between 2 worlds. The ferry was crowded with valley residents in a gala mood, on their way home from market. Many of the men had paid for the ministrations of open-air barbers, so their cheeks gleamed and their hair glistened. Mothers chatted about the children at their sides, petted them and scolding them in turn. Strangers struck up conversations with one another, comparing purchases and trying to establish a connection by comparing family names, occupations, and addresses. They seemed always to find a common friend or ancestor, and then clapped one another on the back like long-lost brothers. They were at ease with themselves and one another like no other people I had ever seen, and I wondered what made it so. Perhaps it was because there were no lords or guards on the boat, not even a scribe, only craftsmen and their families heading home. After the ferry, there was a short, steep climb to the town, which sprawled in the entrance to the valley like a giant wasp nest. My heart fell. It was an ugly place. It was as ugly a place as I had ever seen. In the searing heat of the afternoon sun, the trees along the deserted streets looked limp and dirty. Houses crowded together side by side by the hundreds, each one as unremarkable and drab as the next. The doorways led off the narrow pathways into darkness, and I wondered if I would be too tall to stand erect in the largest of them. The streets gave no hints of gardens or colors or any of the good things in life. Somehow, Minna recognized one street from another and led us to the doorway of his brother's house, where a small boy stood watching. When he saw us, he shouted for his father, and Merritt's second son, Hori, rushed into the street, both hands filled with fresh bread. He ran to Merritt and lifted her up by the elbows, swinging her around and around, smiling with Merritt's own smile. His family gathered and clapped their hands as their grandmother laughed into her son's face and kissed him on the nose. Hori still had a house full of children, 5 in all, ranging from the marriageable daughter to the naked toddler who first spied us. The family spilled into the street, drawing neighbors to the doorways, where they smiled at the commotion. Then Merritt was led through the antechamber to Hori's house and into his hall, a modest room where high windows let in the afternoon light on a brightly colored floor mats and walls painted with lush green garden scenes. My friend was seated on the best chair of the house and formally introduced one by one to her grandchildren. I sat on the floor against a wall, watching Merritt bask in the glory of her children. The women brought food in from the back rooms, where I caught sight of a kitchen garden. Merritt praised the food, which was well spiced and plentiful, and declared the beer better than any she had tasted in the city of the nobles. Her daughter-in-law beamed at those words, and her son nodded with pride. The children stared at me, having never seen a woman quite so tall, or a face so obviously foreign. They kept their distance, except for the little sentinel, who clambered up on my lap and stayed there, his thumb in his mouth. The weight of a child on my chest reminded me of the sweetness of the days I held Ramos so. Forgetting myself, I sighed with such longing that the others turned toward me. "My friend," cried Merritt, who rushed over to my side, "forgive me for forgetting you." The child's mother came and took him from me, and Merritt drew me to my feet. "This is dinner," she announced, and turned me around like a child so that everyone would see my face. "Mina will tell you that she is a friendless midwife he has taken in out of compassion, but I tell you that I am her friend and her sister, and that I am her student. For I have never seen nor heard tell of a more skilled midwife. She has Isa's hands, and with the goddesses of love children, shows the compassion of heaven for mothers and babies." Merritt, her cheeks flushed with the attention of her family, spoke about me like a merchant in the marketplace selling her wares. And she is an oracle too, my dears. Her dreams are powerful, and her anger is to be feared, for I have seen her blast an evil man out of the prime of his life for harming a young mother. She sees clearly into the hearts of men, and none fool her with the fine words that conceal a lying heart. "She comes from the east," said Merritt, now intoxicated with the sound of her own voice and her children's attention. "There, women are often as tall as the men of Egypt, and our Dinar is as clever as she is tall, for she speaks both the language of the East and our tongue. And she gave birth to Ramos, a scribe, the heir of Nectra, who will someday be a powerful power in the land. We are lucky to have his mother among us, and the house of Mina will find itself lucky when she sleeps under his roof." I was mortified to have so many eyes upon me. "Thanks," was all I could say. "Thank you," I said, bowing to Mina and Shifre, and then to Hori and his wife, Takora. Thank you for your generosity. I am your servant in gratitude. I returned to my corner by the wall, contented to observe the family as they ate and joked and enjoyed one another. As the light began to fade, I closed my eyes for a moment and saw Rachel holding Joseph on her lap, her cheek pressed against his. I had not thought of my brother Joseph for years, and I could not place the memory exactly, but the scene was as vivid as my recollections of Leia's touch, as clear in my mind's eye as the tints of Mamre. Even as a child, I knew that Joseph would be the one to carry the family story into the next generation. He would be the one to change into someone more interesting and complicated than simply a beautiful man born of a beautiful mother. Merritt's family thought I napped as I sat by the wall, but I was lost in thoughts of Joseph and Rachel, Leia and Jacob, my aunties and Ina, and the days before Shechem. I sighed again, the sigh of an orphan, and my breath filled the room with a momentary melancholy that announced the end of the welcoming party. Night was falling, and as Mina led Merritt and me through the moonlit streets to his house, which was nearby. Although it was larger and even better appointed than Hori's, it was hot and airless inside, so we carried our pallets up a ladder to the roof, where the canopy of stars seemed only a handbreadth away. I woke just before sunrise and stood up to see the entire town dreaming. They lay alone or in pairs or in clusters with children and dogs. A cat walked down the street below, carrying something in her mouth. She placed it on the ground, and I saw it was a kitten, whom she began to lick clean. As I watched, the sun turned the cliffs pink and then gold. Women stirred and stretched, and then climbed down the ladders. Soon the smell of food filled the air, and the day began. At first, Shifre would not permit me or Merritt to do anything in her kitchen or garden, so the two of us sat useless, watching her work. Merritt had a horror of becoming a meddling mother-in-law, but her hands ached to be busy. "Only let me press out the beer," she asked. "I could sweep the roof," I proposed, but Shifre seemed insulted by our offers. After a week of sitting, I could bear it no longer. Picking up a large empty jug, I announced, "I am going to the fountain," and walked out the door before my hostess could object, surprising myself as well as Merritt. After years of fearing the street in Thebes, I rushed into this one, not entirely sure of where to go, but since there were always other women on their way to and from the fountain, I quickly discovered my route. As I walked, I peered into the doorways and smiled at naked children playing in the dust. I began to see differences between one house and the next. Flowers planted here and there, lentils painted red or green, stools set up by the doorways. I felt like a girl again, my eyes open to the new scenes, my day empty of work. Near the fountain, I overtook a pregnant woman waddling in front of me. "This is not your first, is it?" I asked brightly as I reached her side. When she spun around to look at me, I saw Rachel's face as it must have appeared in the long years before Joseph was finally born to her. The woman's face twisted in anger and desperations. "Oh, my dear," I said, ashamed. I spoke before I understood what this means to you. "Fear not, little mother. This boy will be fine." Her eyes widened with fear and hope, and her mouth dropped wide. How dare you speak to me so? This one will die like the others before. I am hated by the gods. Bitterness and anguish colored her words. I am a luckless woman. My answer came out of me with the assurance of the Great Mother herself, a voice that came through me but not from me. He will be born whole, and soon, if not tonight, then tomorrow. Call me, and I will help you upon the bricks and cut the cord. Ahori was her name, and after we filled our jars, she led me back to the baker's house. She lived only a few doorways east of Mina, and when her time came the following night, her husband came seeking the foreign-born midwife. With merit, I attended as easy and straightforward a birth as any I ever saw. Ahori sobbed with relief as she held the third child of her womb, but the only one born breathing. It was a strapping boy called Denori, the first to be named in my honor. Her husband, a potter, gave me a beautiful jar in thanks, and kissed my hands and would have carried me home in his arms had I permitted it. Merritt spread the story that I had performed some sort of wonder for Ahori, and soon we were busier than we had ever been in Thebes. Most of the men who worked the valley were young, with wives of bearing age, and we attended as many as 10 births in a month. Chiffre no longer had idle guests to feed, and indeed quickly gained more dainties and extra linen than she knew what to do with. Mina was proud to have such respected women under his roof, and treated me like his own aunt. Weeks and months passed quickly, and life in the valley took on its own orderly pace. Mornings were the busiest times before the great heat descended. The men left early and children played in the streets, while the women swept out their homes, cooked their day's meals, and fetched water at the fountains, where news was exchanged and plans laid for the next festival. While the great river was not visible from the town, it still ruled the ebb and flow of the daily life in the arid valley. Its seasons were celebrated in high spirits by the craftsmen who grew up imbibing the rhythms of farming by the Nile. After so many years in the land of the great river, I finally learned the beautiful names of its seasons. Akhik, the inundation; Parrot, the going out; Shimau, the harvest. Each had its own holiday and lunar rite, its own festival foods and songs. Just before my first harvest moon in the valley, a scribe came to Mina's door with a letter from my son. Ramos wrote to say that he was living in Thebes again, assigned as scribe to the new vizier called Zaphanat Paneah, the king's choice. He sent greetings in the names of Amun-Ra and Isis, and a prayer for good health. It was a formal note, but I was happy that he thought of me enough to send it, and that shard of limestone written in his own hand became my most prized possession, and regardless of my protest, became proof of my status as a person of importance. Not long after my son's letter arrived, another man appeared at the door seeking the woman named Dinar. Shifra asked him if it was his wife or his daughter. He had need of a midwife's bricks, but he said neither. Then she asked if he was a scribe with another letter from Thebes, but he said no. I am a carpenter. Shifra came to the garden with curious news about a bachelor carpenter who sought a midwife. Merritt looked up from her spinning sharply and with great show of disinterest said, "Dinar, go and see what the stranger wants." I went without thinking. His eyes were sadder, but in all other ways he was the same. I stood for only a moment before Benia reached out to me with his right hand. Without hesitation, I placed my left hand in it. I extended my right hand and he took it with his left. We stood like that, hand in hand and smiling like fools without speaking until Merritt could stand the suspense no longer. "Oh, dinner," she called with false concern. "Are you there? Or was that a pirate at the door?" I led him back through the house to where Merritt hopped like a bird from one foot to the other, wearing the wild grin of the god Bess. Chiffre smiled too, hoping she learned how Merritt had spent the past months seeking out the artist who had offered me his heart along with a luxurious box that accompanied me from Thebes. They bade him sit and offered beer and bread, but Benia looked only at me, and I returned his gaze. "Go ahead then," Merritt said, giving me a hug and then a push. "Mina will bring your box to you in the morning, and I will follow him with bread and salt. Go in the name of the Lady Isis and her consort Osiris. Go and be content." Leaving my friend's house to follow a stranger, I was surprised by my own certainty, but I did not hesitate. We walked through the streets side by side for what seemed like a very long time, saying nothing. His house was near the edge of the settlement, close to the path leading up to the tombs, many streets away from Merritt. As I walked, I recalled my mother's stories about hennaed hands and songs from the groom and bride on their ways to the bridal tent. I smiled to think of myself as being in a kind of procession at that moment, walking toward my own marriage bed. I smiled too to think of how Merritt would rush from fountain to fountain the next morning, telling everyone about the love affair between Benia and the master carpenter and Dinar, the magical midwife. I nearly laughed at the thought. Benia heard the sound that escaped from my mouth, and as distress, he put his arm around me, placed his lips to my ear, and whispered, "Fear not." Magic words. I laid my head on his shoulder, and we walked the rest of the way, holding hands like children. When we arrived at his house, which was nearly as large as Menace, he took me through the rooms, and with great pride showed me the furniture he had built. 2 throne-like chairs, an ornately carved bed, boxes in many shapes. I laughed when I saw the easing stool, which was far too beautiful for its foul purpose. "I thought of you when I made these things," he said, shrugging in embarrassment. "I thought of you sitting here, sleeping here, putting things to right in your own way. When Merritt found me, I made this for you." He took an exquisite little box from a niche in the wall. It was unadorned but perfect, made of ebony, wood that was used almost exclusively for tombs of kings, and it had been burnished until it shone like a black moon. "For your midwife's kit," he said, and held it out to me. I stared at it for a moment, overwhelmed by his generosity and tenderness. "I have nothing to give you by way of token," I said. He shrugged with one shoulder in a gesture I soon came to know as well as I knew my own hands. "You don't have to give me anything. If you take this from my hands freely, your choice will be your token." Thus I became a married woman in Egypt. Benia laid out a meal of bread and onions and fruit for us, and we sat in the kitchen and ate and drank in nervous silence. I had been a girl the last time I had lain with a man. Benia had been thinking of me since that day in the market 2 years earlier. We were shy as two virgins who had been matched by their parents. After we ate, he took my hand and led me to the main hall, where the fine bed stood, piled with clean linen. It reminded me of Renefer's bed in Nakatra's house. It reminded me of Shalem's bed in his father's house. But then Benia turned me toward him and put his hands on my face, and I forgot every bed I had ever seen before that moment. Lying together was a tender surprise. From our very first night, Benia took great care of my pleasure and seemed to discover his own and mine. My shyness vanished in the course of that night, and as the weeks passed, I found wells of desire and passion that I had never suspected in myself. When Benia lay with me, the past vanished, and I was a new soul, reborn in the taste of his mouth, the touch of his fingers. His huge hands cupped my body and untied secret knots created by years of loneliness and silence. The sight of his naked legs, thick and ropey with sinew, aroused me so much that Benia would tease me with his as he left in the morning, lifting his skirt to reveal the top of his thigh, making me blush and laugh. My husband went to his workshop every morning, but unlike the stonecutters and painters, he did not have to work in the tombs, so he returned to me in the evening, where he and I discovered greater pleasure in each other, and the sorry fact that I did not know how to cook. During my years in Nakatra's house, I rarely strayed into the kitchen, much less prepared a meal. I had never learned how to make bread in an Egyptian oven, or to cut fish or pluck fowl. We ate unripe fruit from Benia's neglected garden, and I begged bread from Mina. Shamefaced, I asked Shifre for a cooking lesson, which Merritt attended only to tease me. I tried to recreate my mother's recipes, but I lacked the ingredients and I forgot the proportions. I felt sheepish and ashamed, but Benia only laughed. "We won't starve," he said. "I have kept myself alive for years on borrowed bread and fruit, and the occasional feast at the house of my fellows and family. I did not marry you to be my cook." But while I was a stranger in the kitchen, I found great joy in keeping my own house. There was such sweetness in deciding where to place a chair, and in the choosing what to plant in the garden. I relished creating my own order and hummed whenever I swept the floor or folded the blankets. I spent hours arranging pots in the kitchen, first in the order of size, then according to color. My house was a world of my own possession, a country in which I was ruler and citizen, where I chose and where I served. One night, when I returned home very late, exhausted, after attending the birth of healthy twins, I thought I had lost my way. Standing in the middle of the street in the dead of night, I recognized my home by its smell, a mixture of coriander, clover, and Benia's cedary scent. A few moments after I moved to my own house, Benia prepared a small banquet for me and Benia. My husband's workmen sang songs of their workshop. Merritt's sons sang of bread, and then all the men together with their wives and children joined voices for love songs together, of which there seemed to be an endless number. I was bashful at the attention showered upon us, the cups raised, the broad smiles and kisses. Even though Benia and I were really too old for such nonsense, we were giddy with delight in each other. When Merritt leaned over and told me to stop grudging people the chance to bask in the light of our shared happiness, I put aside all shyness and gratitude and smiled into the faces of my friends. I had been right to trust Minia, who was the soul of kindness. One night we lay on our backs staring at the heavens. There was only a sliver of moon and the stars danced above when he told me his life. His words came slowly, for many of the memories were sad ones. I have only one memory of my father, said Minia. The sight of his back, which I saw as he walked away from me in the field where I sat behind the plow breaking up clods. I was 6 years old when he died, leaving Ma with 4 children. I was the third son. She had no brothers, and my father's people were not generous. She had to find places for us, so my mother took me to the city and showed my hands to the stone cutters. They took me on as an apprentice and taught me and worked me until my back was strong and my hands calloused. But I became a joke at the workshops. Marble would crack if I walked into a room, and granite would weep if I raised a chisel to it. Wandering in the market one day, I watched as a carpenter repaired an old stool for a poor woman. He saw my belt and bowed low, for even though I was only an apprentice, stone cutters who work in immortal materials are considered far greater than woodworkers whose greatest achievements decay like a man's body. I told the carpenter that his respect was misplaced and that the mere sandstone defeated me. I confessed that I was in danger of being turned into the street. The woodworker took my hand in his, turning it this way and that. He handed me a knife and a scrap of wood and asked me to carve a toy for his grandson. The wood seemed warm and alive, and a doll took shape in my hand without effort. The very grain of the pine seemed to smile at me. The carpenter nodded at the thing I made and took me to the workshop of his teacher, presenting me as a likely apprentice, and there I discovered my life's work. Here my husband sighed. There, too, I met my wife, who was a servant in the house of my master. We were so young, he said softly, and in the silence that followed, I understood that he loved the wife of his youth with his whole heart. After a long pause, he said, "We had 2 sons." Again he stopped, and in the silence I heard the voices of little boys, Vinia's doting laughter, and a woman singing a lullaby. They died of river fever, Vinia said. I had taken them from the city to see my brother, who had married into a farming family. But when we arrived at the house, we found my brother dying, and the rest of his family stricken. My wife cared for them all. He whispered. We should have left, he said, with self-reproach still raw after many years. After that, he said, I lived only in my work, and I loved only my work. I visited the prostitutes once, he confessed sheepishly, but they were too sad. Until the day I saw you in the marketplace, I did not bother to hope for anything. When I first recognized you as my beloved, my heart came to life, he said. But when you disappeared and seemed to scorn me, I grew angry. For the first time in my life, I raged against heaven for stealing my family and for dangling you before my eyes and snatching you away. I was furious and frightened of my own loneliness. So I took a wife. I had been perfectly still until then, but that announcement made me sit up. Yes, he said, embarrassed. My sister found me a marriageable girl, a servant in the house of a painter, and I brought her here with me. It was a disaster. I was too old for her, and she was too silly for me. Oh, Diener, he said, in a misery of apology. We were so mismatched, it could have been funny. We never spoke. We tried sharing my bed twice, and even that was awful. Finally, she was braver than I, poor girl. After 2 weeks, she left, walked out of the house while I was at work, down to the ferry and back to the painter's house where she remains. I was resigned to making strong drinks my regular companion until Merritt sought me out. She visited me 3 times before I would agree to see you. I am lucky that your friend does not understand the meaning of no. I turned to my husband and said, and my luck is measured by your kindness, which is boundless. We made love very slowly that night, and as though for the last time, weeping. One of his tears fell in my mouth where it became a blue sapphire, source of strength and eternal hope. Benia did not ask for my story in return. His eyes would fill with questions when I mentioned my mother's ways of making beer or my aunt's skill as a midwife, but he stepped back from his need to know. I think he feared that I might vanish if he so much as asked me the meaning of my name or the word for water in my native tongue. On another moonless night, I told him as much of my truth as I could, that Remos's father was the son of Renefer, sister of Noctera, and that I came to Thebes after the murder of my husband in our own bed. When he heard that, Benia shuddered, took me into his arms as though I was a child, and stroked my hair, and said nothing but poor thing, which was everything I had longed to hear. Neither of us ever gave voice to the names of our beloved dead ones, and for this act of respect they permitted us to live in peace with our new mates, and never haunted our thoughts by day or visited our dreams at night. Life was sweet in the Valley of the Kings on the west bank of the river. Benia and I had everything we needed in each other. Indeed, we were rich in all ways but one, for we lacked children. I was barren, or perhaps only too old to bear, although I had already lived a full life, close to 20 years. My back was strong, and my body still obeyed the pull of the moon. I was certain that my womb was cold, but even so I could never root out all hope from the heart, and I grieved with the flocks of every new moon. Still, we were not completely childless, for Merritt often sat in our doorstep, trailing her grandchildren, who treated us as uncle and aunt, especially little Kia, who liked to sleep in our house so much that her mother sometimes sent her to stay with us to help me in the garden and to brighten our days. Benia and I shared stories in the evenings. I told him of the babies that I caught and of the mothers who died, though they were blessedly few. He spoke of his commissions, each one a new challenge, based not only upon the desires of the buyer and the builders, but also upon the wishes of the wood in his hand. The days passed peacefully, and the fact that there was little to mark one from the next seemed a great gift to me. I had Benia's hands, Merritt's friendship, the feel of a newborn flesh, the smiles of new mothers, a little girl who laughed in my kitchen, a house of my own. It was more than enough. I knew about Remos's message even before the messenger arrived at my house. Kia ran to the door with the news that a scribe had come to Minna's house seeking Dinor, the midwife, and was on his way to Benia's door. I was delighted at the prospect of another letter from my son. It had been more than a year since the last one, and I imagined myself showing Benia my son's own writing on the limestone tablet when he arrived home that evening. I stood in the doorway, anxious to discover the contents of this letter, but when the man turned the corner, surrounded by a pack of excited little children, I realized that the messenger brought his own message. Remus and I stared at each other. I saw a man I did not know, the image of Noctra, except for his eyes, which were set like his father's. I saw nothing of myself in the Prince of Egypt, who stood before me, dressed in fine linen with gold pectoral gleaming on his chest and new sandals on his manicured feet. I did not know what he saw as he looked at me. I thought I detected disdain in his eyes, but perhaps that was only my own fear. I wondered if he could see that I stood taller now, that I carried less grief on my back. Whatever he saw or thought, we were strangers. "Forgive my manners," I said finally. "Come inside the house of Benia, and let me give you some cool beer and fruit. I know the journey from Thebes is dusty." Remus recovered too and said, "Forgive me, Mother. It is so long since I saw your dear face." His words were cool, and his embrace a quick, awkward hug. "I would gladly take a drink," he said, and followed me into the house. I saw each room through his eyes, which were accustomed to the spacious beauties of palaces and temples. The front room, my room, which I treasured for the colorful wall painting, suddenly looked small and bare, and I was glad when he hurried through it. Benia's hall was larger and furnished with pieces seen only in great houses and tombs. The quality of the chairs and bed found approval in my son's eyes, and I left him there to fetch food and drink. Kia had followed us in and stared at the beautifully dressed man in my house. "Is this my sister?" asked Remus, pointing to the silent child. "No," I said. "This is the niece of a friend, and like a niece to me." My answer seemed to relieve him. "The gods seem to have ordained that you remain my only child," I added. "I am glad to see you healthy and successful. Tell me, are you married yet? Am I a grandmother?" "No," said Remus. "My duties keep me too busy for my own family," he said with a tight little wave of his hands. "Perhaps someday my situation will improve, and I can give you little ones to dandle on your knee." But this was nothing more than polite conversation, which hung in the air and smelled of falsehood. The gulf between us was far too wide for any such familiarity. If and when I became a grandmother, I would know my grandchildren only through messages sent on limestone slabs, meant to be discarded after they are read. "Ma," he said, after drinking from his cup, "I am here not only for my own pleasure. My master sends me to fetch the finest midwife in Egypt to attend his wife's labor." "No, it is true," he said, dismissing my shrug. "Say nothing to diminish your repute, for no one has taken your place in Thebes. The lady of my master has miscarried twice and nearly died from a stillbirth. The physicians and the necromancers have done her no good, and now the midwives fear to attend a princess who has had so much bad luck in childbed. Her own mother is dead, and she is afraid. My master dotes on his wife and wishes nothing more than to have sons by her. Has not heard of your skills from her servants, and asked her husband to search out the foreign-born woman with the golden hands, who once served the women of Thebes. My Lord depends upon me for all things, and called upon me in this matter as well, said Remus, his mouth growing smaller and more pursed at every mention of his master. Imagine my surprise when I learned that he sought none but my own mother. He was suddenly impressed by my lineage when he learned that you were a countryman of his. Remus added ironically, the vizier charged me to put aside duties of state, to walk into the valley of the kings and accompany you to his house. He ordered me not to return without you. You do not like this man, I said mildly. Zaphanat Panah is vizier in Thebes at the king's pleasure, said my son, in formal but demanding tones. He is said to have a great diviner who sees into the future and reads dreams as easily as a master scribe, perusing the glyphs of a schoolboy. But he is illiterate, said Remus bitterly. He cannot cipher or write or read, which is why the king assigned me, the best of Kar's students, to be his right hand. And that is where I am now, wifeless, childless, second to a barbarian. I stiffened at the word. Remus noticed my reaction and colored in shame. Oh, Ma, not you, he said quickly. You are not like the rest of them, or else my father and grandmother would never have chosen you. You are fine, he said. There is no mother in Egypt better than you. His flattery made me smile in spite of myself. He embraced me, and for a moment I regained the loving boy who had been my son. We drank our beer in silence for a moment. Then I said, of course I will follow you to Thebes. If the king's viziers commands you to bring me, I will come. But first I must speak with my friend Merritt, who is my right hand in the birth chamber and should come with me. I must talk with my husband Benia, the master carpenter, so that he knows where I go and when I might return. Remus pursed his lips again. There is no time for this, Ma. We must leave now, for the lady is in travail, and my lord expects me every hour. Send the girl here to inform the others. I cannot tarry. I'm afraid you must, I said, and I left the room. Remus followed me to the kitchen and grabbed me by the elbow, like a master about to strike a disobedient servant. I pulled away and looked into his face. Naktra would sooner die than treat a relative, much less a mother, in this fashion. Is this how you honor the memory of the only father you ever knew? I remember him as a noble man to whom you owe everything, and whose name you dishonor. Remus stopped and hung his head. His ambition and his heart were at war, and his face showed the division in his soul. He fell to the ground and bowed low, his brow at his feet. I forgive you, I said. It will only take a moment to prepare, and we will find my friend and husband on our path to Thebes. Remus raised himself from the ground again and waited outside while I prepared for my journey I hated to make. As I gathered my kit and a few herbs, I smiled at my own brazenness, shaming my powerful son for his rudeness, insisting on my farewells. Where was this meek woman who lived in Nectra's house all those years? Merritt waited for me at her son's door, hungry for the news. Her eyes grew large when I introduced her to Remus, who she had not seen since he was a boy. She covered her mouth in awe at the invitation to wait upon the wife of the king's vizier. But Merritt could not accompany me. 3 women in the town were due to give birth at any moment, and one of them was Ken, the daughter of Shifra's brother. We embraced, and she wished me the touch of Isis and the look of Bess. She stood at her door and waved gaily. "Bring me back some good stories," she shouted, and her laughter followed me down the street. Benia did not send me away with laughter. He and my son looked at each other coolly. Benia dipped his hand in recognition of the scribe's position, and Remos nodded at the carpenter's authority over so important a workshop. There was no way for my husband and me to take a proper leave of each other. We exchanged our parting vows with our eyes. I would return. He would not be content until I did. Remos and I walked out of the valley, saying little to each other. Before we began the descent from the valley to the riverbank, I put my hand on his arm, signaling him to stop. Turning to face home, I dropped a twist of roof from my garden and a piece of bread from my oven to ensure a speedy return. It was dark by the time we reached the river, but we had no need to wait for the morning ferry. The King's bark, lit with 100 lamps, waited for us. Many oars rowed us, and in no time we were hurrying through the sleeping streets of the city and into the great palace, where Remos left me at the door to the women's quarters. I was taken to a chamber where a pale young woman sat perched on her great bed alone. "You are Dinar?" she asked. "Yes, Asnat," I replied gently, placing my bricks on the floor. Let me see what the gods have in store for us." "I fear this one is dead too," she whispered, "and if it is, so let me die with him." I put my ear to her belly and touched the womb. "The baby is alive," I said. "Fear not, he is just resting for the journey." As daylight, her pains began in earnest. Asnat tried to be quiet as befits a royal lady, but nature had made her a screamer, and she soon filled the air with roars at every pang. I called for fresh water to bathe the mother's face, for fresh straw, for lotus cones to freshen the room, and for 5 serving women who gathered around her mistress to offer encouragement. Sometimes it is easier for the poor, I thought. Even those without family live in such close quarters to their neighbors that the cries of the laboring mother bring out other women like geese responding to the call of the leader in flight. But the rich are surrounded by servants too fearful of their mistresses to act as sisters. Asnat did not have an easy time, but it was nowhere near the worst labor I'd seen. She pushed for long hours, supported by women who became her sisters, at least for that day. Just after sunset, she produced a skinny but healthy son who roared for the beast as soon as he was held upright. Asnat kissed my hands, covering them with joyful tears, and sent one of her servants to tell Zelfnat Pana'ah that he was the father of a fine son. I was taken to a quiet room where I fell into a dark, dreamless sleep. I awoke the following morning drenched in sweat, my head throbbing, my throat on fire. Lying on the pallet, I squinted at the light pouring through the high windows and tried to remember the last time I had been ill. My head pounded and I closed my eyes again. When next they opened, the light was draining from the room. A girl sitting by the wall noticed I was awake and brought me a drink and placed a cool towel on my brow. 2 days passed, or maybe it was 3, in a blur of fevered sleep and compresses. When my head finally cooled and the pain subsided, I found myself too weak to stand. By then, a woman called Sherry had been sent to attend me. I stared with an open mouth when she introduced herself, for her name, which means little one, sat oddly upon the fattest woman I'd ever seen. Sherry washed the sour smell from my body and brought me broth and fruit and offered to fetch anything else I might wish. I had never been waited upon like that, and while I did not enjoy her hovering over me, I was grateful for her help. After a few days, my strength began to return, and I asked Sherry to tell me the news of the baby I had delivered. She was delighted by my question and settled her weight about her on a stool, for Sherry loved an audience. The baby was well, she reported. He is ravenous and has nearly worn off his mother's nipples with constant feeding, said Sherry with a wicked grin. She had pitied her mistress's childlessness, but found Osnat an arrogant snip of a mistress. Motherhood will teach her everything, my new friend confided. The father has named the boy Minash, an awful name that must mean something fine in his native tongue. Minash, it sounded like chewing, does it not? But you are of Cana as well, are you not? I shrugged. It was so long ago, I said. Please continue with the story, Sherry. It is almost magical, the way your words make me forget my aches and pains. She gave me a sharp look to let me know that flattery did not hide my reticence, but she continued anyway. Zevnat Pana'a is truly an arrogant son of a bitch, she said, proving her trust in me by swearing about the master. He likes to talk of his lowly beginnings as though this makes his powerful position even greater due to his rise. But this is no great thing in Egypt. Many great men, statesmen and craftsmen, warriors and artisans are born of the lowly. Such is the case with your own husband. Dinar? She asked, letting me know that my history was not entirely closed to her, but I only smiled. The Canaanite is handsome, no doubt about that. Women swoon at the sight of him, or at least they did when he was younger. Men are drawn to him as well, and not only the ones who prefer boys. Of course, that beauty did not serve him well when he was young. His own brothers hated him so much they sold him to a pack of slavers. Can you imagine an Egyptian doing such a thing? Every day I think the gods I was born in the valley of the great river. No doubt, I said, surveying her girth, for there was no other land that could support such excess. Sherry caught my meaning and grabbed at her midsection with both hands. Ha ha, I am a creature of amazing proportions, am I not? The king once pinched me and said that only dwarves please him more than the sight of someone as large and round as me. You would not believe how many men find this desirable, Sherry said. In my own youth, she began in a conspiratorial whisper, I gave pleasure to the old king until his wife grew jealous and had me packed off to Thebes. But that, she winked, is another story for another time. You want the history of this house, which is juicy enough, she confided. Zevnat Pana'a was sold into slavery, as I said, and his new masters were swine, the most Canaanite of Canaanites. I don't doubt that he was beaten and raped and forced to do the dirtiest work. Of course, His Majesty does not speak of that anymore. Zevnat Pana'a did not acquire that pompous name until recently. The gods speak and he lives indeed. They used to call him Stick, for when he first came to Egypt, he was skinny as his newborn son. When his owners came to Thebes, he was sold to Potiphar, a palace guard with sticky fingers who lived in a great house on the outskirts of the city. Because Stick was more clever than his master by half, he was put in charge of the garden and then given oversight of the wine pressing. Finally, he was set above the other servants in the house, for Potiphar loved the Canaanite boy and used him for his own pleasure. But Potiphar's wife, a great beauty called Nebuchadnezzar, also looked upon him with longing, and the two of them became lovers right under the master's nose. There is even some gossip about who fathered her last daughter. In any case, Potiphar finally discovered them in bed together, and he could no longer pretend not to know what was going on. So in a great show of anger and vengeance, he sent Stick to prison. By that point, I had lost interest in Sherry's story, which apparently had no end. I wanted to sleep, but there was no stopping the woman who did not see my hint when I yawned, or even when I closed my eyes. The Theban jail is no laughing matter, she said darkly, a hideous pit where men die of murder and despair as much as fever, full of madmen and cutthroats. But the warden came to pity his handsome inmate, who was neither hateful or insane. Soon he was taking his meals to the Canaanite, who spoke a good Egyptian by then. The warden was a bachelor and childless, and he treated Stick like a son. As the years passed, he gave Stick responsibility for his fellows, until finally he was the one to determine which man slept near a window and which man was chained close to the latrine. So the inmates did what they could to bribe and please him. I tell you, Denor, Sherry said, shaking her head in admiration, wherever this fellow goes, power seems to move into his hands. Meanwhile, the old king died, and the new king had a habit of punishing minor offenses against him by sending people to jail. If he was displeased by the texture of his bread at dinner, he might send the baker to jail for a week or even longer. Cupbearers, wine stewards, sandal makers, even captains of the guard were sent to languish in the place where they met Stick. Everyone was struck by his princely bearing and by his ability to interpret dreams and divine the future. He told one poor drunkard that he would not live out the week, and when he was found dead, not murdered, mind you, simply done in by years of strong drink, the prisoners proclaimed him an oracle. When a cupbearer returned from prison with a story about a jailer who saw into the future, the king sent for Stick and sent him to interpret a series of dreams that had plagued him for months. It was not a difficult dream to divine, if you ask me, said Cherry. Fat fish being devoured by bony fish, fat cows being trampled by skinny cows, and then 7 fat stalks of wheat which were beaten down, leaving 7 dead stalks. Any half-wit magician who pulls birds from beneath baskets in the marketplace could have interpreted that one. Cherry sniggered, but the dreams haunted and frightened the idiot king, and it calmed him to hear that he had 7 years in which to prepare for the coming of famine. And so he elevated the jailer, an unlettered, foreign-born conniver, to become his first in command. I imagine your son has already told you that this so-called Zephanat Pana'ah is totally dependent upon Remos, and now that Zephanat is not only a vizier but a father as well, there will be no stopping his pride. Sherry fumed, bustling around the room, preparing my bed, for she had talked away the whole afternoon. And yesterday she grumbled, speaking to herself by that point. This madman demanded that his son be circumcised, not when he is at manhood's door and able to withstand such a thing, not like civilized people, but now, immediately. Can you imagine wanting to do that to a tiny baby? It only goes to prove that a born barbarian does not change. Asnot screamed and carried on like a gutted cat at the order, and I can't blame her there. Joseph, I whispered in horror and disbelief. Sherry peered up at me. What? She said. What did you say, Dinar? But I closed my eyes suddenly, unable to breathe. All at once I understood why I had been summoned to Thebes, and why Sherry had told me the endless story of the Vizier. But surely this could not be. It was fever that weakened my reason. Dizzy and lightheaded, I lay down on the bed panting. Sherry noticed that something was amiss with me. Dinar, she said, are you unwell? Can I get you something? Maybe you are ready for solid food now. But here is something to cheer you up, she said, looking up at the sound of footsteps. Your son comes to pay respects. Here is Remus. I will bring you both some refreshment. She burbled and left me with my son. Mother, he said, formally, with a stiff bow. But when he saw my face, he started. Ma, what is it? They told me you were much improved and that I might see you today, he said doubtfully, but perhaps this is not the right time. I turned my face toward the wall and waved him out of the room. I heard Sherry go out with him and murmur an explanation. His hurried footsteps fading in the distance were the last thing I knew before I fell asleep. Sherry had told Remus of our conversation and repeated the word I had spoken before falling back into a fevered darkness of mind. Thus my son took Joseph into his mouth and unannounced went into the great hall where the Vizier of Egypt sat alone, whispering comfort to his firstborn son, who had been circumcised earlier that day. Joseph, said Remus, throwing the name at him like a challenge, and the one known as Zephnath Pana'ah trembled. Do you know a woman called Dinar? He demanded. For a moment Zephnath Pana'ah said nothing, and then he asked, Dinah? The master looked into his scribe's eyes. I had a sister named Dinah, but she died long ago. How do you come by her name? How do you know of Joseph? He commanded. I will tell you what there is to tell after you describe her death, said Remus, but only then. The threat in his voice rankled Joseph, but even though he sat on a throne with a healthy son in his arms and guards ready to do his bidding, he felt bound to answer. It had been a lifetime since he had heard his own name, 20 years since he had spoken his sister's name aloud. So he began in a quiet voice that drew Remus close to the throne. He told him that Dinah had gone to the palace in Shechem with his mother, Rachel the midwife, to tend to a birth in the house. A prince of the city claimed her for a bride, and Joseph and Remus heard how Jacob turned away the handsome bride price and finally accepted him only on the cruelest conditions. Remus shuddered to learn his father's name from Joseph's lips, but in the next moment he learned that my brothers, his own uncles, had slaughtered Shalem in his own bed. Remus bit his tongue to keep from crying out. Joseph declared this repugnance from the crime and proclaimed his own innocence. 2 of my brothers bloodied their hands, he said, but admitted that perhaps 4 of them had had some part in the murder. All of us were punished. She cursed us all. Some of her brothers fell ill, others saw their sons die. My father lost all hope, and I was sold into slavery, Joseph said. I used to blame my sister for my misfortunes, but no longer. If I knew where she was buried, I would go and pour libations and build a stele in her memory. At least I survived my brother's villainy, and with the birth of the son, God of my fathers, shows me that I will not die forgotten. But my sister's name was blotted out, as though she had never drawn breath. She was my milk sister, said Joseph, shaking his head. It is strange to speak of her now that I am a father. Perhaps I will name the next one in her honor. And he fell silent. And what is Joseph? Remus asked. Joseph is the name my mother gave me. said Zephaniah Pana'ah quietly. Ramos turned to leave, but the vizier called him back. Wait, we have a bargain. Tell me how you came to know my name and the name of my sister. Ramos stopped and without facing him said, She is not dead. The words hung in the air. She is here in your palace, indeed. You bade her, brought here. Dinar, the midwife, the one who delivered your son, is your sister, Dinah, my mother. Joseph's eyes grew wide in wonder, and he smiled like a happy child, but Ramos spit at his feet. Would you have me call you uncle? He hissed. I hated you from the first. You robbed me of my position that is rightly mine, and you advanced in the king's eye because of my skill. Now I see that you blasted my life from birth. You slaughtered my father in the prime of his youth. You and your barbarian brothers murdered my grandfather too, who, though a Canaanite, acted honorably. You ripped the heart out of my grandmother. You betrayed your sister, widowed my mother, and made me an orphan and an outcast. When I was a boy, my grandmother's servants told me that when I finally found my father's murderers, their names would rip my soul into pieces. His words were true. You are my uncle. Oh God, what a nightmare. Ramos cried. A murderer and a liar. How dare you claim innocence in this abomination? Perhaps you raised no sword yourself, but you did nothing to stop them. You must have known something of the plot. You and your father and the rest of his seed. I see the blood of my father on your hands. Your guilt is still on your eyes. Joseph looked away. There is nothing left but for me to kill you or die a coward. If I do not avenge my father, I will be unworthy of this life, much less the next. Ramos's voice raised in hatred alerted the guards who subdued him and led him away, while Minash wailed in his father's arms. When I finally woke, Sherry sat beside me, her face stricken. What is it? I asked. Oh, lady, she said in a great rush to tell me what she knew. I have bad news. Your son and the vizier have quarreled, and Ramos is under guard in his chambers. The master is said to be furious, and they say that the young scribe is in mortal danger. I do not know the cause of their quarrel, not yet at least, but when I learn it, I will tell you immediately. I got to my feet, wobbling but determined. Sherry, I commanded, listen to me now, for I will not argue or repeat myself. I must speak with the master of the house. Go and announce me. The serving woman bowed from the waist, but in a small voice said, You cannot go to Zephaniah Pana'ah looking as you do. Let me give you a bath and dress your hair. Put on a clean gown so you can make your case like a lady and not a beggar. I nodded my assent, suddenly frightened by the sense ahead. What words could I use to a brother I had not seen for a lifetime? I crouched in the bath with Sherry poured cool water over me and leaned back as she brushed and arranged my hair. I felt like a slave about to be paraded before a gallery of buyers. When I was ready, Sherry led me to the door of Zephaniah Pana'ah's hall, where he sat with his head in his hands. Dinar, the midwife, requests an audience, she said. The vizier stood up and waved me in. Leave us, he barked. Sherry and all his retainers disappeared. We were alone. Neither of us moved. We kept our places on opposite ends of the room and stared. Though the years had cost him his smooth cheeks and a few of his teeth, Joseph was still fair of face and strong, still the son of Rachel. Tina, he said, a haughty little sister, he said, in a language of our youth, the grave will set you free. Yes, Joseph, I said. I am alive and amazed to be in your presence. But the only reason I come to you is to ask what has become of my son. Your son knows the story of his father's death, and he threatens my life, said Joseph stiffly. He holds me responsible for the sins of my brothers. His threat alone could cause his execution, but because he is your son, I will only send him away. He will not come to harm, I promise, said Joseph kindly. I have recommended that the king give him charge of a prefecture in the north, where he will be second to none. In time, he will fall in love with the sea. They all do. And he will build a life seasoned with salt air and salt water, and not wish for any other. You must tell him to do as I say and forget this talk of revenge, said Joseph. You must do this now, tonight. If he raises a hand to me, if he so much as threatens me in the company of my guard, he must die. I doubt that my son will listen to my words, I said sadly. He hates me, for I am the cause of his unhappiness. Nonsense, said Joseph with the supreme self-confidence that made our brother so jealous. The men of Egypt honor their mothers like no other men in the world. You do not know, I said. He called his grandmother Ma. I was no more than his wet nurse. No, Dina, said Joseph. He suffers too much for that to be true. He will listen to you, and he must go. I looked at my brother and saw a man I did not know. I will do as you say, master, I said, in the voice of a good servant. But ask me for nothing else. Let me be free of this place, for it is a tomb to me. Seeing you is like stepping into the past where my sorrow lies. And now, because of you, I lose all hope of my son. Joseph nodded. I understand, a haughty, and it will be, as you say, except in one matter, when my wife comes to the bricks again, and I have already dreamed of a second son. You must come and attend her. You may come without seeing me if you like, and you will be well paid. Indeed, you will be paid in land if you wish, you and the carpenter. I bridled at the suggestion that I was a pauper, and announced my husband Benia is a master craftsman in the Valley of the Kings. Benia, he asked, and Joseph's face crumbled into regret. That was the baby name for our brother Benjamin, the last born of my mother, who died giving him life. I used to hate Benia for killing her, but now I think I would give half of what is mine only to hold his hand. I have no desire to see him, I said, surprising both of us with the anger in my voice. I am no longer of that world. If my mothers are dead, then I am an orphan. My brothers are no more to me than the livestock of our youth. You and I were kin as children when we knew each other well enough to share our hearts, but that was in another life. The great room was silent, each of us lost in memories. I will go to my son, I said finally. Then I will be gone. Go in peace, said Joseph. Ramos lay face down on the bed in his handsome suite. My son did not move or speak or show any sign of recognition. I spoke to his back. His windows overlooked the river, which glittered in the moonlight. Your father loved the river, I said, fighting tears. And you will love the sea. I will not see you again, Ramos, and there will be no other opportunity to speak these words again. Listen to your mother, who comes to say goodbye. I do not ask you to forgive my brothers. I never did. I never will. I ask only that you forgive me for the bad luck of being their sister. Psst. Forgive me for never speaking to you of your father. That was your grandmother's command, for she saw secrecy as the only way to keep you from the agony that cuts you low today. She knew that the past could threaten your future, and we must continue to protect you against the accidents of birth. The true story of your parentage is still known only to you, me, and Zephaniah Pana'ah. There is no need to tell anyone else. But now that we share this secret, I will tell you something else. Remus, your father, was called Shalem, and he was as beautiful as the sunset for which he was named. We chose each other in love. The name I gave you in my breast The name I gave you in my breast was Bar Shalom, son of the sunset, and your father lived in you. Stop it. Your grandmother called you Remus, making you a child of Egypt and the sun god. In either language and in our country, you are blessed by the great power of the heavens. Your future is written on your face, and I pray that you will have the fullness of years denied to your father. May you find contentment. I will remember you in the morning and in the evening, every day until I close my eyes forever. I forgive your every harsh thought of me and the curses you may hurl at my name. And when at last you do forgive me, I forbid you to suffer a moment's guilt in my name. I ask that you remember only my blessings upon you, Bar Shalom Remus. My son did not move from his couch or say a word, and I took leave broken-hearted but free. Returning home was like being reborn. I buried my face in the bed linens and ran my hands over every piece of furniture, every garden plant, delighted to find things where I had left them. Kaya walked in to find me embracing a water jug. I sent her to tell Merritt I was home, and then walked as fast as I could to Benia's workshop. My husband saw me approach and rushed out to greet me. It seemed that we had been parted for years rather than days. "You are so thin, wife," he whispered as he held me in his arms. "I fell ill in the city," I explained, "but I am healthy again." We studied each other's faces. "Something else happened," Benia said, drawing his fingers across my forehead and reading something of the past day's shocks. "Are you back to stay, beloved?" he asked, and I understood the cause of the shadows beneath his eyes. I reassured him with an embrace that earned us a loud hoot from the men in the workshop. "I will be home as soon as I can," he said, kissing my hands. I nodded, too happy to say more. Merritt was waiting with warm bread and beer when I returned to my house, but when she saw me, she cried, "What did they do to you, sister? You are skinny as bone, and your eyes look as though you have wept a river." I told my friend about the fever and about Remus's quarrel with his master. When my friend heard that he was posted to the north, her eyes filled with sympathy. After we ate what Merritt had brought, she ordered me to do the bed and massaged my feet. All the pain of the past weeks melted as she kneaded my toes and cradled my heels. After I was at peace and still, I asked her to sit by my side, and I took her hand, still warm and moist with oil, and told her the rest of what had happened to me in the king's right hand in Thebes, including how it came to pass that Zephaniah Pana'ah, the king's right hand, was my brother Joseph. Merritt listened in stillness, watching my face as I recounted my mother's history and the story of Shechem and the murder of Shalem. My friend did not move or utter a sound, but her face revealed the workings of her heart, showing me horror, rage, sympathy, compassion. When I finished, she shook her head. "I see why you did not tell me this before," she said sadly. "I wish I had been able to help you bear this burden from the very first. But now that you entrust your past to my keeping, it is safe. I know you need no oath from me, or else you would not have told me. Dear one, she said, putting my hand to her cheek, I am so honored to be the vessel into which you pour your story of pain and strength. For all these years, no daughter could have made me happier or more proud than you. Now that I know who you are and what life has cost you, I am in awe that I number you among my beloved. After a comfortable silence, Merritt gathered her things and prepared to leave. I will go to give you time to prepare for Benia's arrival, she said, taking my 2 hands in hers. Blessings of Isis, blessings of Hathor, blessings of the mothers of your house. But before she walked out the door, my friend's face regained its impish grin, and with a friendly leer she said, I will call upon you tomorrow. See if you can't get off your back long enough between now and then to make us something to eat for a change, eh? Benia ran in soon after, and we fell upon the unmade bed like youthful lovers, breathless and hurried. Afterward, knotted in each other's clothes, we slept the famished sleep of reunited lovers. I awoke once in the night, startled and smiling, hating to close my eyes upon the joy of being home. After my return, I never fully lost my reverence for ordinary pleasures. I arose before Benia to study his face and breathe silent prayers of thanks. Walking to the water fountain or pulling weeds in the garden, I was overcome by the understanding I had spent a whole day without the weight of the past crushing my heart. Birdsong brought me to tears, and every sunrise seemed a gift shaped for my eyes. When the vizier's messenger arrived at our door, as I knew he would someday, I froze with dread at the thought of leaving for so much as a day. But to my relief, the letter did not summon me to the great house on the east bank. Joseph's dream had been fulfilled, and a second son was born to him. This one came so fast, however, that Asnat did not have time to send for me before the one called Ephraim found his way into the world. Even though I had rendered him no service, Safnat Pana'ah sent a gift of 3 links of snowy linen. When Benia asked me why the gift was so extravagant, I told him everything. It was the 3rd time I had given voice to the 4th story, first to Warren Rowe, then to Merritt. But this time my heart did not pound, nor my eyes fill as I told it. It was only a story from the distant past. After hearing me out, Benia took me in his arms to comfort me, and I nestled into the sheltering peace between Benia's hands and beating heart. Benia was the rock upon which my life stood firm, and Merritt was my wellspring. But my friend was older than I by a generation, and age was taking its toll. The last of her teeth had fallen from her mouth, for which she claimed herself grateful. No more pain, she chuckled. No more meat either, she said, with a doleful shrug. But her daughter-in-law, Chiffre, chopped and mashed every dish, and my friend remained hearty and enjoyed her beer and her jokes as much as ever. She attended many births with me, taking delight in newborn smiles, weeping over the deaths that came our ways. We shared countless meals, and I always left her table chuckling. We knew her days were numbered and kissed each other goodbye at every parting. Nothing between us was left unsaid. The morning came when Kaya appeared at the door to say that Merritt could not rise from her bed. I am here, dear one sister, I said when I arrived at her side, but my old friend could no longer give me greeting. She could not move at all. The right side of her face had collapsed and her breathing was labored. She returned the pressure of my fingers in her left hand and blinked at me. "Oh, sister," I said, trying not to weep. She stirred, and I could see that even though she was nearing death, Merritt was trying to comfort me. That would not do. I looked into her eyes and managed a midwife's smile. I knew my task. "Fear not," I whispered, "the time is coming. Fear not, your bones are strong. Fear not, good friend, help is nearby. Fear not, Anubis is a gentle companion. Fear not, the hands of the midwife are clever. Fear not, the earth is beneath you. Fear not, little mother. Fear not, mother of us all." Merritt relaxed and closed her eyes, surrounded by sons and daughters, grandsons and granddaughters. She sighed one long sigh, the wind through the reeds, and left us. I joined with the women in the high-pitched keening death song that alerted the whole neighborhood to the passing of the beloved midwife, mother, and friend. Children burst into tears at the sound, and men rubbed their eyes with damp fists. I was heartbroken but comforted by one of Merritt's last gifts to me, for at her deathbed I became one of her grieving family. Indeed, I was treated as the oldest female relative and given the honor of washing her withered arms and legs. I swaddled her in Egypt's finest linen, which was mine to give. I arranged her limbs in the crouch of the baby about to enter the world and sat with her through the night. At dawn, we carried her to rest in a cave on a hill overlooking the tombs of kings and queens. Her sons buried her with her necklaces and rings. Her daughters buried her with her spindle, her alabaster bowl, and other things she loved. But the midwife's kit had no place in the next life, and it passed to the keeping of Shifri, who held Merritt's tools with reverence, as though they were made of gold. We buried Merritt with song and tears, and on the way home laughed in her honor, recalling her delight in surprises, jokes, food, and all the pleasures of the flesh. I hoped that she would continue her enjoyment of these in the life to come, which she believed to be much like this world, only deathless and eternal. That night I dreamed of Merritt and woke up laughing at something she said. The following night I dreamed of Bila, waking to tears on my cheeks that tasted of the spices my aunt used in her cooking. One night later, Zilpa greeted me, and we flew through the night sky, a pair of she-hawks. When the sun set again, I knew I would meet with Rachel in dreams. She was as beautiful as I remembered. She ran through a warm rain that washed me clean as a baby, and I woke up smelling as though I had been bathed in well water. Eagerly I awaited the dream of Leia, but she did not come the next night or the night after. Only at the dark of the new moon was I visited by the mother of my flesh. It was the first time my body failed to give the moon her due. I was past giving life, and my mother, who had borne so many children, came to comfort me. "You are the old one now," she said gently. "You are the grandmother, giving voice to wisdom. Honor to you." My mother, Leia said, touching her forehead to the ground before me, asking forgiveness. I lifted her up, and she turned into a swaddling baby, holding her in my arms. I begged her pardon for ever doubting her love, and I felt her pardon in the fullness of my heart. I went to Merritt's tomb the morning after Leia's dream and poured out wine, thanking her for sending my mothers back to me. With Merritt gone, I was the wise woman, the mother, the grandmother, and even great-grandmother of those around me. Shifra, a new grandmother, and Kaya, about to be married, attended me wherever I went to place the bricks. They learned what I had to teach and soon went on their own to deliver women from the fear and loneliness of birth. My apprentices became sister and daughter. In them I found new water in the well. I thought I would remain forever dry after my merit died. Months passed and years, many days busy, many nights peaceful, but there is no lasting peace before the grave, and one night, after Benia and I had gone to bed, Joseph appeared inside our door. The sight of him there, clad in a long black cloak that turned him into a shadow, was so strange that I thought him part of a dream. But the edge of my husband's voice woke me to the moment, suddenly dark and dangerous. "Who comes into my house without knocking?" he growled, like a dog sensing danger, for this was clearly no distraught father in search of a midwife. "It is Joseph," I whispered. I lit lamps, and Benia offered my brother the best chair, but Joseph insisted on following back to the kitchen, where I poured him a cup of beer, which sat untouched. The silence was thick and stiff. Benia's hands were clenched, for he was fearful I was about to be taken from him. His jaw was locked, for he was unsure how to speak to the noble perched on a stool in his kitchen. Joseph sent me glances full of unspoken urgency, for he was unwilling to speak in front of Benia. I looked from one face to the other and realized how old we had grown. Finally, I told Joseph, "Benia is your brother now. Say what it is you came to say." "It's Daddy," he said, using a baby word that I had not heard since Canaan. "He is dying and we must go to him." Benia snorted in disgust. "How dare you," Joseph said, jumping to his feet and putting his hand on the dagger at his side. "How dare you," Benia replied, with equal passion, stepping closer. "Why should my wife weep by the bedside of a father who murdered her happiness and his own honor? A father who sent you to the long knives of men known for their ruthlessness." "You know the story, then," said Joseph, suddenly defeated. He sat down and put his head in the hands and groaned. "They sent me word from the north, where my brothers and their sons tend the flocks in Egypt. Judah said that our father will not live out the season and that Jacob wishes to give my sons his blessing." "I do not wish to go," Joseph said, looking at me as though I had some answer for him. I thought I had finished with my duty there. I thought I had even forgiven my father, though not without exacting a price. When they came to my house starving and seeking refuge, I twisted the knife. I accused them of theft and forced them to grovel before the mighty Zephnath Pana'ah. I watched Levi and Simon put their foreheads to the ground at my feet and tremble. I gloated and sent them back to Jacob, demanding Benjamin be sent. I punished our father for choosing favorites. I punished my brothers too, and I kept them in fear of their lives. Now the old man wishes to place his hands on the heads of my boys to choose them for his blessing, not the sons of Reuben or Judah, who have supported him all these years and borne his moods and whims, not even the sons of Benjamin, the lastborn. I know Jacob's heart. He wishes to atone for the wrongs of the past by blessing my sons, but I fear for them with such a birthright, they will inherit tormenting memories and strange dreams. They will come to hate my name. Joseph railed on as Benia and I listened. The hurts of the past clung to him, caught in the folds of his long dark cloak. He flailed around like a drowning lamb as he talked about fat years and lean years, about loneliness and sleepless nights, about how life had treated him so cruelly. I searched for the brother I remembered, the playfellow who listened to the words of women with respect and who once looked at me as his friend. I saw nothing of that boy in this self-absorbed man before me, whose mood and voice seemed to change from moment to unhappy moment. I am a weakling, said Joseph. My anger has not abated, and I have no pity in my heart for Jacob, who has become blind like his father before him, and yet I cannot say no to him. Messages get lost, I said softly. Messengers are sometimes waylaid. No, Joseph said. That lie would finally kill me. If I do not go, he will haunt me forever. I will go, and you will come with me, said Joseph, suddenly shrill, a man accustomed to power. I did not try to hide my disgust at his tone, and when he saw my contempt, he dropped his head in shame. And then my brother bowed down with his forehead on the dirt floor of a carpenter's kitchen and apologized to me and to Benia too. Forgive me, sister. Forgive me, brother. I do not wish to see my father die. I do not wish to see him at all. And yet I cannot disobey. It is true that I can force you to go with me, and for no other reason than to hold my hand. But you will prosper in this too. He stood and resumed the demeanor of Zephaniah Pana'ah. You will be my guest, he said smoothly. The master carpenter will do business on behalf of the king. I will go purchase the timber in the north, and I require the services of an artist who knows how to select the finest wood. You will go to the marketplace of Memphis and see the olive, oak, and pine in abundance, choosing only what belongs in the king's house and tomb. You will bring honor to your profession and to your own name. His words were seductive, but Benia looked only at me. When Joseph brought his face close to mine and gently said, Ahati, this is your last chance to see the fruits of your mother's wombs, their grandsons and granddaughters, for those are not only the children of Jacob, they are also the children of Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, and Bilhah. You are the only aunt of their mothers. Blood and our mothers would wish for you to see their granddaughters. After all, you are the only daughter, the only they loved, the one they loved. My brother could talk the wings off a bird, and he talked until the sun rose, and Benny and I were exhausted. Although we never said yes, there was no saying no to Zephaniah Pana'ah, the king's vizier, just as there had been no saying no to Joseph, son of Rachel, grandson of Rebekah. We left with him in the morning. At the river we were met by a bark of surpassing luxury, filled with chairs and beds, painted plates and cups, sweet wine and fresh beer. There were flowers and fruit everywhere. Benia was stunned at the riches, and neither of us could look into the faces of the naked slaves who waited upon us with the same servility. They showed Zaphanet and his 2 sons and their noble retinue. The lads were old enough to grow their hair, and they were good boys, curious about their father's guests, but polite enough not to ask questions. Benia delighted them by carving little creatures out of wood and naming each one. He caught me watching him, and his plaintive smile told me that he had done the same for his own sons, dead long ago. Asnat did not come with us, and Joseph never spoke a word of his wife. My brother was attended by a youthful guard, all of them as beautiful as he had been in his youth, and I often saw him staring at his handsome companions wistfully. He and I barely spoke on the voyage north. We took our meals separately, and no one suspected that the carpenter's wife had anything to say to the powerful vizier. When we did exchange words to say good morning or to comment about the children, we never spoke in each other's mother tongue. That might have drawn attention to our foreign birth, which was a sore point among many in the king's service. Joseph kept to himself at the prow of the bark, under a gleaming awning, wrapped in his dark cloak. Had I been alone, I might have sat like him, reliving the journey that had brought me to the house of Noctura, where I became a mother, remembering too the loss of my son. Had it not been for Benia, I would have thought of the impending meeting with my brothers and opened the old wounds in my heart. But Benia was always nearby, and my husband was captivated by the sights of the journey that was for him, like the gift of an extra life. He directed my eyes at the sails and the winds, or when the air was still, at the harmony of the rowers' oars. Nothing escaped his attention, and he pointed to horizons and trees, birds in flight, men plowing the fields, wildflowers, a stand of papyrus that looked like a field of copper in the setting sun. When we came upon a herd of water horses, his excitement was matched only by that of Joseph's boys, who crowded by his side to watch the children of Terawit splash and roar in the reeds. On the third day of the journey, I set aside my spinning and sat quietly, watching the water lap against the shore. My mind as calm and wordless as the surface of the river. I inhaled the loamy smells of the river and listened to the sound of the water on the hole, which was like a constant breeze. I trailed my fingers through the water, watching them grow wrinkled and white. "You are smiling," said Benia as he came upon me. "When I was a child, I was told that I would only find contentment beside a river," I told him. "But it was a false prophecy. The water soothes my heart and settles my thoughts, and it is true that I feel home by the water, but I found my joy in dry hills, where the fountain is distant and the dust is thick." Benia squeezed my hand, and we watched Egypt pass, emerald green, while the sun sparked the water into countless points of light. In the morning and at the sunset, when the bark docked for the night, Manasseh and Ephraim would jump into the water. The servants watched for crocodiles and snakes, but my husband could not resist the boys' invitation to join them. He removed his loincloth and jumped in with a roar that was answered by childish squeals. I laughed to see my husband dive under the surface and shoot up again like a heron, like a boy. When I told Benia of a dream in which I was a fish, he grinned and promised to make it so. So one night, under a full moon, Benia put his finger to my lips and led me down to the water's edge. Silently, he motioned for me to lie back in his arms, where he held me effortlessly, as though I were as light as a baby, and he were strong as 10 men. With his hands, he coaxed and reassured me until I put my head back and clenched my hands and lay as though on a bed. When I relaxed, my husband released me so that I felt only his fingertips on my back, while the river held me and the moonlight turned the water silver. Every night I grew bolder. I learned to float without the support of my husband's hands, and then to move on my back, facing the waning moon. He showed me how to stay on the surface and swim like a dog, kicking and kneading the water for dear life. I laughed and swallowed water. It was the first time I had frolicked like a child since my son was a baby. By the end of the journey north, I could duck my head underwater and even swim side to side with Benia, whispering on our pallet afterward. I told him about the first time I ever saw anyone swimming at the river on our way to Haran. "They were Egyptians," I said, remembering their voices. I wondered if they were comparing the that river with this just as I am tonight. We turned to each other and made love as silently as fishes, and slept like children rocking on the bosom of a great river source and fulfillment. At Tennis, we left the river and began the journey into the hills where the sons of Jacob lived. In Egypt, farmers and even tanners were held in higher esteem than shepherds, whose work was considered the lowest and most odious of occupations. The official purpose of Zephaniah Panah's journey was to conduct a census of the flocks and to select the finest animals for the king's table. In fact, this was a task beneath his station, the sort of thing usually assigned to a middle-ranked scribe. Still, it served my brother as an excuse to visit the relations he had not seen for 10 years, since he granted them refuge from the famine in Canaan. Traveling in Zephaniah Panah's caravan was nothing like the journeys of my childhood. My brother was carried on a litter by his military bearers, and his sons rode donkeys behind him. Benia and I, who walked, were surrounded by servants who offered cool beer or fruit if we so much as raised a hand to shade our eyes. At night we rested on thick pallets under pure white tents. Luxury was not only the difference. The journey was very quiet, almost hushed. Joseph sat alone, his brow knit, his knuckles white on the arms of his chair. I was uneasy too. There was no way for me to speak to Benia without being overheard. Only the sons of Joseph were carefree. Manasseh and Ephraim dubbed their donkeys Humpum and Mumpum, and invented stories about them. They tossed a ball back and forth between them and laughed and complained that their backsides were black and blue from riding. Had it not been for them, I might have forgotten how to smile. After 4 days, we came upon the camp where the sons of Jacob lived. I was shocked by the size of it. I had imagined a gathering like the one in Shechem, with a dozen tents and half as many cooking fires. But there was a whole village. Scores of women with covered hair scurried back and forth, carrying water jugs and firewood. Babies' cries rose from the murmur of my mother's tongue, being spoken, shouted, and crooned in the accents both familiar and unfamiliar. But it was the smells that brought me to tears. Onions frying in olive oil and musky dust of the herds mixing with the perfume of baking bread. Only Benia's hand kept me from faltering. The delegation of the tribe's leaders walked forward to meet the Viziers, their kinsmen. Joseph faced them with his sons at his sides, flanked by his handsome guards. Behind them stood servants, bearers, and slave girls, and off to one side a carpenter and his wife. Joseph's face was nearly white with anxiety, but he showed his teeth in a large false smile. The sons of Jacob stood before us, but I recognized none of these old men. The eldest among them, his face deeply lined and hidden by dirty gray hair, spoke slowly, awkwardly in the language of Egypt. He delivered formal greetings to Zephaniah Panah, their protector and savior, the one who had brought them to the land in peace and fed them. It was only when he switched to the speech of his birth that I recognized the speaker. In the name of our father Jacob, I welcome you, brother, to our humble tents, said Judah, who had been so beautiful in his youth. Teddy is near the end, he said. He is not always in his own mind and thrashes on the bed, calling for Rachel and Leah. He wakes out of a dream and curses one son, but in another hour blesses the same man with lavish praise and promises. But he has been waiting for you, Joseph, you and your sons. As Judah spoke, I began to recognize some of the men behind him. There was Dan with his mother's black moss-like hair, his skin still unlined and his eyes calm as Bilah's. It was no longer difficult to distinguish Naphtali from Issachar, for Tali was lame and Issachar stooped. Zebulun still resembled Judah, though he looked far less worn down by life. Several of the younger men, my nephews, I guessed, recalled Jacob as he had been in his youth, but I could not guess whose sons they were, or which might be Benjamin. Joseph listened to Judah without once meeting his brother's eyes, which were fixed upon him. Even when Judah was finished speaking, Joseph did not reply or lift his head. Finally, Judah spoke again. "These must be your boys. What names did you give them?" "Minash is the older, and this is Ephraim," Joseph replied, placing his hands upon their heads in turn. Hearing their names, the boys looked up to their father, their faces shining with curiosity about what was being said in the strange-sounding tongue. They had never before heard that from their father's mouth. "They barely understood why we are here," Joseph said. "I do not know myself." Anger flashed across Judah's face, but it quickly changed to defeat. "There is no undoing the wrongs of the past," he said. "Still, it is good of you to give the old man a peaceful death. He lived in torment from the moment we called you dead, and he never recovered even after he learned you were still alive." "Come," said Judah, "let us go and see if our father is awake, or will you eat and drink first?" "No," Joseph said, "better to do it." Taking his sons by the hand, Joseph followed Judah to the tent where Jacob lay dying. I stood with the rest of Zephaniah-Paneah's servants and retainers, watching as they disappeared into the dusty village. I was fixed to the earth, trembling, furious that not one of them knew me. But I was relieved, too. Benaiah led me gently to where the servants were setting up tents for the evening, and we waited there. There was barely time to number my feelings before Joseph reappeared, with Minash and Ephraim, their eyes fixed on the ground in fear. My brothers strode past me and into his tent without a word. Benaiah could not coax me to eat that night, and although I lay down beside him, I did not close my eyes. I stared into the darkness and let the past wash over me as it would. I remembered Reuben's kindness and Judah's beauty. I remembered Dan's voice and song, and the way Gad and Asher mimicked our grandfather until I collapsed in laughter. I remembered how Isa and Tali wept when Levi and Simon tormented them and said they were interchangeable in their mother's eyes. I remembered how Judah once tickled me until I peed, but never told a soul. I remembered how Reuben used to carry me on his shoulders from where I could touch the clouds. Finally, I could lie still no longer and walked out into the night where Joseph waited for me. Pacing by the side of my tent, we walked away from the camp slowly, for there was no moon and darkness covered everything. After some distance, Joseph flung himself onto the ground and told me what had happened. At first, he did not know me, my brother said. Daddy whimpered like a tired child, crying, "Joseph, where is Joseph?" I said, "Here I am," but he still asked, "Where is my son Joseph? Why does he not come?" I put my mouth to his ear and said, "Joseph is here with his sons, just as you asked." After many such exchanges, he suddenly understood and grabbed my face, my hands, my robes. Weeping, he repeated my name over and over and begged forgiveness of me and of my mother. He cursed the memory of Levi and Simon and Reuben too. Then he wailed because he had not forgiven his firstborn. He named each of my brothers in turn, blessing them and cursing them and turning them into animals, sighing over their boyhood pranks, calling out to their mothers to wipe their bottoms. How horrid to grow old like that, said Joseph, with pity and disgust in his voice. I pray I die before that day comes when I do not know if my sons are infants or grandfathers. Jacob seemed to sleep, but after a moment he called out again, "Where is Joseph?" as though he had not already kissed me. "Here I am," I answered. "Let me bless the boys," said Jacob. "Let me see them now." My sons trembled at my side. The tent stank with his illness, and his ranting had frightened them. But I told them that their grandfather wished to bless them, and I pushed them toward him, one on either side. He put his right hand on Ephraim's head and his left hand on Manasseh's. He blessed them in the name of Abram and Isaac, then sat up and roared, "Remember me." They shrank back and hid behind me. I told Jacob his grandson's names, but he did not hear me. He stared sightless at the roof on the tent and spoke to Rachel, apologizing for abandoning her bones at the side of the road. He wept for his beloved and begged her to let him die in peace. He did not notice when I left with my sons. As Joseph spoke, I felt an old heaviness return in my heart and recognized the weight I had carried during my years at Nachdorah's house. The burden was not more made of sorrow as I had thought. It was anger that rose out of me and found its lost voice. "What of me?" I said. "Did he mention me? Did he repent for what he did to me? Did he speak of the murder of Shechem? Did he weep for the innocent blood of Shalem and Hamor? Did he repent for the slaughter of his own honor?" There was a silence from the ground where Joseph lay. He said nothing of you, Dinah. Dinah is forgotten in the house of Jacob. His words should have laid me low, but they did not. I left Joseph on the ground and stumbled back to the camp by myself. I was suddenly exhausted and every step was an effort, but my eyes were dry. After Joseph arrived, Jacob stopped eating and drinking. His death would come within hours, days at the most, so we waited. I passed the time sitting at the door of my tent, spinning linen, studying the children of Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, and Bilhah. I saw my mother's smiles and gestures and heard their laughter. Some of the connections were as clear as daylight. I recognized an exact copy of Bilhah in what had to be Dan's daughter. Another little girl wore my Aunt Rachel's hair. Leah's sharp nose was evident everywhere. On the second day of Jacob's death watch, a girl approached, a basket of fresh bread in her hands. She introduced herself in the language of Egypt as Jerah, the daughter of Benjamin and his Egyptian wife Neset. Jerah was curious to discover how a woman of my status sat and spun while the others who attended Zaphanath Pana'ah cooked and fetched and cleaned all day. I told my sisters that you must be a nurse to the sons of the vizier, my uncle. She said, "Is it so? Did I guess well?" I smiled and said, "You made a good guess," and asked her to sit down and tell me of her sisters and brothers. Jerah accepted my invitation with a satisfied grin and began to lay out the warp and weft of our family. "My sisters are still children," she said the girl, herself still a few years away from womanhood. "We have twins, Mijua and Nama, who are too young to even spin. My father Benjamin had sons in Canaan as well, by another wife who died. My brothers are called Bela, Bekshur, and Ehi, and Ard, and they are good enough fellows, though I do not know them any better than the sons of my uncles, who are as numerous as our flocks, just as noisy, she said, and winked at me as though we were old friends. You have many uncles, I said. 11, Jera said, but the 3 oldest are dead. Ah, I nodded, bidding farewell to Reuben in my heart. My niece settled in beside me, drawing a spindle from her apron, and setting to work as she unraveled the skein of our family's history. The eldest was Reuben, son of Leah, my grandfather's first wife. The scandal there is that Reuben was found lying with Bilhah, the youngest of Jacob's wives. Jacob never forgave his firstborn even after Bilhah died, even though Reuben gave him grandsons and more wealth than the rest of the brothers combined. They say my uncle wept for Jacob's forgiveness when he died, but his father would not come to him. Simon and Levi, also born of Leah, were murdered in Tanis when I was a baby. No one knows the whole tale there, but among the women there is talk that the 2 of them tried to get the better of a traitor in some small matter. For their victim they chose the most ruthless cutthroat in Egypt, who killed them for their greed. Jera looked up and saw Judah walking into Jacob's tent. Uncle Judah, son of Leah, who has been clan leader for many years. He is a fair man and bears the burdens of the family well, though some of my cousins think he's grown too cautious in his old age. Jera went on teaching me the story of my brothers and their wives, pointing out their children, reciting the names of nieces and nephews, flesh of my flesh, with whom I would never exchange a word. Reuben had 3 sons with his wife Zillah. His second wife, Akar, bore him 2 girls, Bina and Ephrat. Simon had 5 sons by the odious Ialutu, whom Jera remembered as an awful scold with bad breath. He had another son by a Shechemite woman, but that one walked into a flooded wadi and drowned. My mother says he killed himself. And Jera in a whisper, that man over there is called Merari. She said, the miracle in him is that he had a good fellow despite the fact that he was born to Levi and Inbu. His brothers are as bad as their father was. A slack-jawed man shuffled up to Jera, who handed him a bit of bread and sent him away. That was Shelah, she explained, Judah's son, Bashua. He is feeble-minded but sweet. My uncle had a second wife named Tamar, who gave him Peretz and Zerach. And my best friend, Daphna. She is the beauty of the family in this generation. Over there is Hesea, she said, nodding to a woman nearly my own age, wife to Issachar, son of Leah. Hesea is the mother of 3 sons, Tola, who has taken up the midwife's life. If Daphna is heir to Rachel's beauty, Tola has her golden hands. Who is Rachel? I asked, hoping to hear more of my aunt. That is your master's mother, she said, surprised by my ignorance. Though I suppose there is no reason for you to know her name. Rachel was the second wife, Jacob's beloved, the beauty. She died giving birth to Benjamin, my father. I nodded and patted her hand, seeing the shape of Rachel's fingers. Go on, dear, I said. Tell me more. I like the sound of your family's names. Dan was the only son of Bilhah, Jera said. She was Jacob's 3rd wife, Rachel's handmaid, and the one who lay with Reuben. Dan has 3 daughters by Timnah, named Edna, Tirzah, and Berit. All of them are kind-hearted women. They are the ones who tend to Jacob. Zilpah was the 4th wife, handmaiden to Leah, and she bore twins. The first was Gad, who loved his wife Sarah. Imnah with a great love, but she died giving birth to her fourth child, her first daughter Sarah, who was gifted with song, said Jerah. Asher, Gad's twin brother, married Orit. She continued. Their eldest was a daughter, Areli, who gave birth to a daughter last week, the newest soul in the family, whose name is Nina. Leah's Naphtali fathered 6 children upon Yedida, whose daughters are Elisheva and Benaiah. And of course, you know the sons of Joseph better than anyone, Jerah said. He has no daughters, she asked. Not yet, I replied. Jerah caught sight of 2 young women and pointing at me, nodded her head emphatically. Those are 2 of the daughters of Zebulun, son of Leah. Their mother, Ahava, produced 6 girls who are their own little tribe. I like it when they include me in their circle. It's a merry group. Leora, Mahalat, Gia, Yara, Noadiah, and Yael, she said, counting out their names on her fingers. They have the best gossip. It was they who told me the story of the Shechemite woman's son who killed himself. He went mad, she said, lowering her voice, when he learned the terrible circumstances of his birth. What could have caused him such despair, I asked. It's an ugly tale, she replied coyly, leaning in to whet my interest. Those often make for the best stories, I answered. Very well, Jerah said, setting down her spinning and looking me straight in the eye. According to Auntie Ahava's story, Leah had one daughter who lived. She must have been a great beauty, for she was taken in marriage by a Shechemite nobleman, a prince, in fact, the son of King Hamor. The king brought Jacob a handsome bride price with his own hands, but it wasn't enough for Simon and Levi. They claimed that their sister had been kidnapped and raped, and that the family honor was demeaned. They put up such noise that the king, bowing to his son's great passion for Leah's daughter, doubled the bride price. Still, my uncles were not satisfied. They claimed it was a plot of the Canaanites to take what was Jacob's and make it Hamor's. So Levi and Simon tried to undo the marriage by demanding that the Shechemites give up their foreskins and become Jacobites. Now comes the part of the story that makes me think it is nothing more than a tale that girls tell each other. The prince submitted to the knife, he and his father and all the men of the city. My cousins say this is impossible because men are not capable of such love. In the story, though, the prince agreed. He and the men of the city were circumcised. Jerah lowered her voice, setting a dark tone for the sorrowful ending. 2 nights after the cutting, while the men in the city groaned in pain, Levi and Simon stole into the city and slaughtered the prince, the king, and all of the men they found within the gates. They took the livestock and the women of the city too, which is how Simon came to have a Shechemite wife. When their son learned about his father's villainy, he drowned himself. My eyes had been fixed upon my spindle as she recounted the tale. And what of the sister, I asked, the one who was loved by the prince? That is a mystery, said Jerah. I think she died of grief. Sarah made up a song about her being gathered by the Queen of Heaven and turned into a falling star. Is her name remembered? I asked softly. Dinah, she said. I like the sound of it, don't you? Someday, if I am delivered of a daughter, I will call her Dinah. Jerah said nothing more about Leah's daughter and prattled on about feuds and love affairs among her cousins. She chatted until late in the afternoon before thinking to ask about me, and by then I could excuse myself, for it was time for the evening meal. Jacob died that night. I heard one woman sobbing and wondered who among the daughter-in-laws wept for the old man. Benia folded me in his arms, but I felt neither grief nor anger. Jera had given me peace. The story of Dinah was too terrible to be forgotten. As long as the memory of Jacob lived, my name would be remembered. The past had done its worst to me, and I had nothing to fear of the future. I left the house of Jacob better comforted than Joseph. In the morning, Judah prepared to take Jacob's body to lie with his father in Canaan. Joseph watched as they lifted his bones into the gold-covered litter which he gave for the funeral voyage. Before Judah left to put his father into the ground, he and Joseph embraced for the last time. I turned away from the sight, but before I reached my tent, I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to face Judah, whose expression was a map of uncertainty and shame. He held out a fist to me. "It was our mother's," he said, struggling to speak. "When she died, she called me to her and said to give this to her daughter." "I thought she was out of her mind," said Judah, "but she foresaw our meeting. Her mother never forgot you, and although Jacob forbade it, she spoke of you every day until she died. Take this from our mother, Leah, and may you know peace," he said, pressing something into my hand before walking away. His head hung low. I looked down to see Rachel's lapis ring, Jacob's first gift to her. At first I thought to call Judah back and ask him why my mother had sent me the token of Jacob's love for her sister, but of course he would have no way of knowing. It was good to see the river again. After the heat of the hills, the embrace of the Nile was sweet and cool. And at night, in Benia's arms, I told him all that I had heard from Jera and showed him the ring. I puzzled over its meaning and prayed for a dream to explain the mystery, but it was Benia who gave me the answer. Holding my hand to the light and peering at it with eyes practiced at seeing beauty, he said perhaps your mother meant it as a token that she had forgiven her sister. Maybe it was a sign that she died with an undivided heart and wished the same for you. My husband's words found their mark, and I recalled something that Zilpah had told me when I was a child in the red tent and far too young to understand her meaning. "We are all born of the same mother," she said. "After a lifetime, I know that to be true." Although the journey was uneventful and my hands were idle, I was exhausted by the trip home. I longed to return to my own house to see Shifra and Kaya's baby, who had been born during my absence. I was terribly restless during my 3-day stops in Memphis, but kept my impatience to myself because of Benia. He returned from the marketplace every evening, overflowing with the beauty he had seen. He exclaimed at the silkiness of the olive wood and the pure black of the ebony, the aromatic cedars, and he brought back scraps of pine and taught Joseph's sons to carve. He bought me a gift too, a picture in the shape of a grinning Teruet that made me smile every time I looked at her. The vizier's bark trailed a barge laden with fine timbers when they sailed out of Memphis for the last part of the journey to Thebes. Joseph and I said goodbye in the darkness on the last night. There was no need for sorrow in our parting, he said lightly. There is only a farewell. If Asnat bears again, we will call for you. But I knew he would not meet again. Joseph, I said, it is out of our hands. Be well, I whispered, touching his cheek with a hand that bore his mother's ring. I will think of you. I will think of you too, he replied softly. In the morning, Benny and I eagerly turned to the west. Once home, we resumed the order of our days. Kaya's new son was good-natured, and he learned to crow happily when his mother handed him to me on nights she went to attend at a birth. I rarely accompanied her past sunset, though, for I was growing old. My feet ached in the morning and my hands were stiff, but I still counted myself lucky that I was neither feeble nor dull. I had strength enough for my house and to care for Benia. He remained strong and sure, his eyes ever clear, his love for his work and his love for me as constant as the sun. My last years were good ones. Kaya had 2 more babies, another boy and a girl, who took over my house and my husband's heart. We received countless sweet-breathed kisses every day. "You are the elixir of youth," I said, as I tickled them and laughed with them. "You sustain these old bones, you keep me alive." But not even the devotion of little children could stave off death forever, and my time arrived. I did not suffer long. I woke in the night to feel a crushing weight on my chest, but after the first shock, there was no pain. Benia held my face between his great warm hands. Kaya arrived and cradled my feet between her long fingers. They wept, and I could not form the words to comfort them. Then they changed before my eyes, and I had no words to describe what I saw. My beloved turned into a beacon as bright as the sun, and his light warmed me through and through. Kyra glowed like the moon, and sang with the green and solemn voice of the Queen of the Night. In the darkness, surrounded by shining lights of my life, I began to discern the faces of my mothers, each one burning with their own fire. Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, and Bela, Ina, Raineffer, and Merritt, even poor Rudy and arrogant Rebecca, were arrayed to meet me. Although I had never seen them, I recognized Ada and Sarai as well. Strong, brave, wonder-struck, kind, gifted, broken, loyal, foolish, talented, weak, each one welcoming me in their way. "Oh," I cried in wonder. Benia held me even tighter and sobbed. He thought that I had suffered, but I felt nothing but excitement at the lessons that death held out to me. In the moment before I crossed over, I knew that the priests and magicians of Egypt were fools and charlatans for promising to prolong the beauties of life beyond the world we are given. Death is no enemy, but the foundation of gratitude, sympathy, and art. Of all life's pleasures, only love owes no debt to death. "Thank you, beloved," I said to Benia, but he did not hear me. "Thank you, daughter," I said to Kaya, who had put her ear to my chest, and hearing nothing started to keen. I died, but I did not leave them. Benia sat beside me, and I stayed in his eyes and in his heart. For weeks and months and years, my face lived in the garden. My scent clung to the sheets. For as long as he lived, I walked with him by day and lay down with him by night. When his eyes closed for the last time, I thought perhaps I would finally leave the world, but even then I lingered. Chiffre sang the song I taught her, and Kaya moved with my motions. Joseph thought of me. When his daughter was born, Jaron named her baby Dina. Ramos married and told his wife about the mother who had sent him away so that he would not die but live. Ramos's children bore names unto the 100th generation. Some of them lived in the land of my birth, some in the cold and windy places that were no described by the light of my mother's fires. There is no magic to immortality. In Egypt, I loved the perfume of the lotus. A flower would bloom in the pool by dawn, filling the entire garden with blue musk, so powerful it seemed that even the fish and dust would swoon. By the night, flowers might wither, but the perfume lasted, fainter and fainter, but never quite gone. Even many days later, the lotus remained in the garden. Months would pass, and a bee would alight near the spot where the lotus had bloomed, and its essence was released again, momentarily but undeniable. Egypt loved the lotus because it never dies. It is the same for people who are loved. Thus can something as insignificant as a name, 2 syllables, one high, one sweet, summon up the innumerable smiles and tears, sighs and dreams of a human life. If you sit on the bank of a river, you see only a small part of its surface, and yet the water before your eyes is proof of unknowable depths. My heart brims with thanks from the kindness you have shown me by sitting on the bank of this river, by visiting the echoes of my name. Blessings on your eyes and on your children, blessings on the ground beneath you. Wherever you walk, I go with you. Selah. And that's it. The red tent. Happy sleeping.